Tax day's always a pain. Next year could be a nightmare. If Congress fails to extend Trump's tax cuts, middle-class families will get hit with a huge tax increase. That means less money for groceries, less money to pay your mortgage, less money for school supplies, and less money for family vacations. A $1,500 tax increase? That's enough to give families the cold sweats. Avoid the nightmare. Save Trump's tax cuts. Learn more at protectprosperity.com. Paid for by Americans for Prosperity.
This episode is brought to you by Peloton. Everyone has a reason to change. Growing old, heartbreak, a fresh start. Whatever it may be, Peloton is here to get you through life's biggest moments with workouts that challenge and motivation that keeps you coming back. Peloton's Tread and All Access membership helps you set your targets, track your progress, and get stronger, making your fitness goals a reality. Find your push. Find your power. Peloton. Visit onepeloton.com.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Woźniarska, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at The Oregonian. Today, I'm with award-winning environmental journalist Alan Weisman. Alan has written multiple books and reported news stories for national magazines and for public radio from more than 60 countries and all 7 continents. And today, we're here to talk about his new book, Hope Dies Last, which he'll discuss at Powell's Books in Portland tonight. This book profiles scientists, engineers, activists, and environmentalists who are doing incredible things to repair some of our planet's most devastated ecosystems and help us avoid climate disaster. And I've invited Alan Weisman here because I think we all need to think about hope, and we all need a little inspiration these days. So I think this would be a great conversation. Welcome to the show, Alan.
Thanks, Gosia.
So I want to start with talking about sort of the central theme of your book, which is hope. Your book came out on Earth Day at a very particular moment in time in the U.S. We're 3 months into a very chaotic Trump administration that, really seems to want to upend all of our climate initiatives. Why did you decide to write a book about hope in an era when climate change seems to be getting worse every day? And how do you think it fits into this particular moment in time?
Well, I think you've kind of answered your own question. I mean, we need hope more than ever right now. So I set out to find what are our realistic hopes for getting through this bottleneck century that we are in, which has now only been exacerbated by the Trump onslaught. And I want to emphasize, though, that the hope that I found was not the kind that involves wishing that things would get better or praying that some genius will come through with some miraculous invention that will save us, though there are some stories in here about some wildly creative discoveries that may prove crucial to the mix that we're going to need. But the kind of hope that my real-life protagonists embody is an action verb. It's not a passive state. They don't wait for miracles. They keep trying to make them. And I can't imagine what else I should be writing about right now.
Yeah, it's kind of the perfect book for our time. This book was about 10 years in the making, and you traveled around the U.S. and the world to interview these amazing people, who are doing the work against all odds. Can you tell us how you found them, and maybe give us 2 examples of some of these inspiring visionaries that you met and what they're doing?
So every morning I read a wide swath of news media and scientific journals, various listservs that I'm on. Having worked in all these countries, I have a lot of tentacles out there. I ask other journalists, I ask scientists, and they lead me to these important and amazing stories, sometimes too many, and I kind of let them percolate, and eventually my subconscious starts to decide which are the ones that I need to report. Now, there's one that I'd written about earlier that I knew that I wanted to revisit in this book. Its origins were with 2 college students who were volunteers on a campaign to delay logging in the Pacific Northwest until protection for the northern spotted owl under the Endangered Species Act would finally stop timber companies from mowing down Oregon and Washington. One of them was actually arrested for yoking his neck to a Forest Service gate with a bicycle lock. A few years later, these guys met up again in 1989 in New Mexico. They were working as contract biologists for the Forest Service, and they ended up suing their employers who were trying to inflate the count of Mexican spotted owls to prove that they weren't endangered so they could sell clear-cutting leases. So long story short, they ended up winning that suit, and then they formed what today is the Tucson-based Center for Biological Diversity, which has sued more than 900 times on behalf of animal and plant life, from polar bears to orchids to slugs, and they've won nearly 90% of the cases. They use the Endangered Species Act, which is one of the world's most powerful environmental protections, like a bludgeon. President Nixon signed that act, but now President Trump threatens to defang it, along with protections for forests and waters and, of course, the climate. So they, of course, are back in court. I've been in the wilds and in federal courtrooms with them. They are relentless, which is a quality that I cherish in all the people I met for this book. Mm-hmm. So another one is from one of the Earth's poorest places, a Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, where people are living in these stifling one-room huts, over 1 million of them. And what I saw was a solar and battery-powered Wi-Fi network that let them trade and share energy with their neighbors to power fans and light bulbs and charge mobile phones. Each cluster of huts then connects to the surrounding clusters and so on, and it's all done without power lines. The same thing is being done in some Sudanese refugee camps, and if people ever get to go home, they're going to leave behind this big solar battery that locals can keep using. The creator of this, it's a Dhaka-based company called SoulShare, is now outfitting and connecting Bangladesh's 1 million plus electric rickshaws, or 3 million plus, with solar chargeable batteries whose remaining juice each night will help feed the national grid. This is clean, it's technically easy, it saves everybody money. It just makes so much sense.
Yeah, that's incredible. And that's one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yeah.
Wow. I have to mention a story that really spoke to me, which was the story of Azam Al-Wash. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Yes, perfect.
So Azam Al-Wash is an Iraqi engineer who was exiled to the U.S. For a time, studied in California, and then came back to Iraq to basically restore the biggest wetland in the Middle East. And he, when he returned to Iraq to launch on this project, he was basically told that restoring the salt marshes was impossible. I have this quote that I marked in the book where he says that impossible often masks a lack of imagination. And he asked, how will we know unless we try? So here was a man who was standing before this impossible project, as he was told, and he was willing to try it because he had a hunch that it could work. Yeah. And it did.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, all these biologists told him that these marshes had been drained by Saddam Hussein to flush out Shiite rebels. And this is the biggest wetland in all of the Middle East, hugely important for migratory birds, etc., and home to all these Madan people who they're known as the Marsh Arabs, and they've been living on these floating islands since Sumerian times out there. And it had turned into a desert. He tried to raise money internationally, couldn't, and finally he and one of his associates they rented an earth mover for $30, and they just punched holes through Saddam's dike, let the water come in, and it poured in there. And then for 2 months, it just was this sort of stinking mess that nothing was happening. But then green shoots started to appear along the sides. And now today it's a functioning ecosystem, and all these people are back with their water buffalo and these animals and the birds. It was just a joy to be out there with them. I lead the book with his story because of the quote that you came up with. It's so important, to to defy the odds and to try to take a big risk. And
Yeah.
time after time, I saw it happening.
But his story is also one of frustration because he has this much bigger vision for his country and even for the Middle East, about turning to clean energy, and that vision goes nowhere, basically.
Well, it goes nowhere yet.
Mm-hmm.
Another quality of all the people that I found is that they just don't quit. If something doesn't work, they try something else.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, you have to play the long game. You know, Nobody I met is giving up.
Yeah.
One of the most heart-wrenching stories in this book is when Ojibwe women, who are their tribe's water keepers, were unable to stop the Enbridge Corporation from ramming their Line 3 pipeline, which carries Athabascan tar sands crude, one of the filthiest of all fossil fuels,
Mm-hmm.
right through their wild rice harvesting grounds and under 200 lakes and rivers, including the Mississippi in northern Minnesota.
Yeah.
But their elders never stopped resisting. And I follow one of them, Winona LeDuc, who just keeps on. She's known so many disappointments, but I saw her open this solar furnace factory that's now providing good jobs, and starting a commercial hemp farming project as an alternative to working on the corporate McDonald's French fry potato plantations that surround her reservations. And at one point, Winona says, the only path to hope is to hope big.
Mm.
And I love that quote because it epitomizes this visionary thinking, seeing the big picture, daring to take big risks, take on big power, even daring to fail big, especially when honor is at stake.
Mm.
Because then from lessons learned, they just strategize, what to do next.
Yeah.
Another example, Jelton Anjane, whose father was called the Moses of the Marshall Islands for rescuing his people from an atoll that the U.S. had irradiated during hydrogen bomb tests. Jelton's now a STEM educator to their descendants in collaboration with a sustainability project that's funded by the Roddenberry Foundation, Star Trek people, and the U.S. Navy. They're funding it. That will help make the Marshalls a more livable place as long as it's still above water, but will also help prepare the next generation to go into the diaspora with good employable skills should they ever have to abandon their lovely islands. I mean, is that a sad story? Yes, but it's not a hopeless story. I mean, look, there's going to be plenty to grieve upcoming, but in life, we just can't let grief defeat us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that brings me to your title again, Hope Dies Last. As you mentioned, there's plenty to grieve. Your book doesn't sugarcoat the problems, nor the solutions, nor the situations that you're describing. And, some of these are very sad stories. And, to somebody, they might not even seem very hopeful. But, I'm wondering if you can talk about this complexity in your title. Some of these stories are about people who have amazing ideas, and yet these ideas are trampled by lack of political will, by people's inability to see that these ideas are actually good. A series of other problems. The inevitability of the fact that, let's say, these islands will be underwater someday. And so I'm wondering, can you address that complexity at the heart of your book?
Well, look, the ecosystem we know is infinitely complex. Human beings we know are infinitely complex. Any of us who is alive and in relationships know that, it just never ends. We are complicated creatures. And yet, we still manage to accomplish an awful lot. And any solutions out there that pretend to be simple are suspect. I mean, my title, Hope Dies Last, I sort of discussed the etymology of the word hope at one point in this book. And the title is intentionally ambiguous. Hope dies last. To the end, there's still hope. Or, in the end, maybe hope dies. Well, we're not at that end yet. I mean, here we are, you and I doing this work. And that means that as long as we're still alive, we're still hoping. And everybody who's listening to this, the same thing. Do we get desperate sometimes? Sure. Despair is part of life. Overcoming despair is part of the game. And, everybody I met was an extraordinary example of people who just absolutely refuse to give up and quit, and to finding us a way to the future. And because I had to confront some big existential problems every single day in my research, believe me, it was easy to feel down. But ultimately, by the end of this book, I was really uplifted. These people made me realize that this ain't over.
And if one door is closed, as the saying goes, maybe there's another one that will open somewhere and you can get through it.
Well, the only way that you can find a solution is to try. If we don't try, failure is automatic.
Yeah.
At one point, I have a scene with Azam Alwish, who you've mentioned. We're standing at the top of what is called the Persian Gulf by the Iranians and the Arabian Gulf by the Kuwaitis and the Iraqis. And this sounds familiar. And he's with the head of an NGO, environmental NGO in the city of Basra, which is now one of the hottest cities on earth. And I mean, so many environmental problems there. And this guy is describing them to Alwash. And Azam just puts his hand on his shoulder and he says, failure is not an option. And I saw it fill this young man. He really got it. And I hear from him. I'm in touch with everybody in this book, and they're all still out there plugging.
Wow. President Trump has called climate change a hoax, frozen climate funding, environmental justice programs, thrown out the window, threatened to go after local, state, environmental nonprofits. In the face of this barrage of threats and executive orders, and importantly, money being pulled away from researchers, scientists, organizations, who used to get funding from the U.S. to do this work, how can we support these projects, whether they are happening in Iraq or happening in Portland, Oregon, or happening elsewhere in the U.S.? Like, who should be stepping up, both financially and in other ways, when our federal government is, literally pulling the carpet from out of climate and environmental work?
Well, this is a time that we all have to step up. We can do it in numerous ways. I mean, some of them just to make our lives more comfortable. You invest in heat pumps or solar panels, which will pay for themselves in energy savings within a couple of years and then keep on saving. We can make sure that we go to nature to recharge our souls, but then that place that you like to go, adopt that place and take whatever action is needed to make sure that it stays natural. Call your elected officials repeatedly, demand that they grow a spine, show up at their town halls, get in their faces. There's a great story that I love and I find very inspiring in this book about this upstart organization called Climate Defiance. It's this unlikely collection of self-described nerds, Gen Zers, and queers who are screaming truth right into the face of power. And for the last 2 years, they've been hounding politicians who take oil money by leaping onto stages when they're speaking to accuse them of frying their future. I saw them do that to the CEO of Bank of America, who's one of the world's biggest fossil fuel financiers. And they harassed a deputy interior secretary, the one who approved the Willow Project in Alaska, so much that he quit. They were key to getting Joe Biden to pause the liquid natural gas plant buildup on the Gulf Coast, which Trump unfortunately has rescinded. But they keep coming. They have not stopped under Trump. They're now getting thrown in jail, and the rest of us have to keep coming with them. Some judges and senators are now showing courage, which is encouraging, even though, they were taken by surprise by Trump's swiftness and viciousness, and the courts have been letting him break laws with impunity, but he can't break the laws of physics. And, monster tornadoes and superstorms, mega infernos, bomb cyclones, atmospheric rivers, all of this is showing us what's overheating our atmosphere. And, presidents can hide in bunkers, but most voters can't. And next time I predict they'll know what to do. But we really have to prime that pump by being out there right now and not saying, not being submissive, not being defeated, because that's the way autocrats work. They play on our fears so we don't act. Mm-hmm. We have to act.
Yeah, we have to act and not give up. In your book, you say there are 4 world emergencies, or sort of these big issues that have to be addressed through, visionary ideas and through everybody's help. Can you briefly talk about what those are?
Yeah, well, obviously the first is the climate crisis. We're blowing past 1.5 degrees centigrade. And as the head of Google's artificial intelligence climate program tells me at one point in this book, 2 degrees isn't the ceiling, it's the floor. Because currently we're on track for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's business as usual scenario of over 4 degrees increase over pre-industrial averages. Second is the major extinction event we're perpetrating. We've been pushing species off the planet. In one day, it'll be one too many, but we won't know which until it's too late. The third and fourth are really intertwined. How can we grow enough food for an expected 2 billion more people by mid-century without further damaging the planet by mowing down more habitats or forcing our food supply with yet more of the synthetic fertilizer that's responsible for 1/3 of all greenhouse gases? Now, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, whose invention in 1913 suddenly allowed us to grow much more plant life on this planet than nature ever could, is the main reason why our population suddenly quadrupled in a single century, which is probably the biggest population explosion for a large animal in the history of biology. But we can't keep growing on a planet forever that doesn't grow. And this one's already bursting at the seams.
Yeah.
Look, I love my species, but we've just become too much of a good thing. And one way or another, our population is going to have to come in balance with planetary carrying capacity. Either we'll manage that gracefully, such as by educating girls who usually defer their childbirth until their studies are complete, and then on the average only have 1 or 2 so they can use their education to support them. Or if we don't, then nature's going to do it to us, and that's not going to be pretty. I mean, it's already happening. Witness the storms and the hellfires that are coming down on us.
Yeah. I feel like the, this growth factor is something that is very interesting to me. In fact, you wrote a book almost 10 years ago, I think 8 or 9 years ago, that talked about overpopulation. And since you wrote that book, we've added another billion humans to our planet. the basis of your current book, you're looking at people who are doing these visionary things, in human ingenuity, maybe human technology, and how that can help us in the future. But it seems to me like our capitalist society can't just keep pumping more growth and more people, because even if we'll have great ideas, that's just not going to be enough to save us. I mean, are people actually working on the population issue? And should that sort of be our number one focus as we move forward?
Well, sometimes people, when I wrote that book Countdown, would ask me, if I thought population was the big environmental problem that we had. And I put it this way: I say, if we didn't have so many people on the planet, would we have any environmental problems?
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, but the fact is, even if we all went to the one-child policy that China tried, tomorrow, it would still take, because there are so many people already, it would still take like 2 generations before the population came down to, probably something that could really fit on this planet, a couple of billion people, living comfortably, like a European lifestyle, without destroying it. We don't want to go out there and cull a whole bunch of people right away. So the humane thing is to figure out how we're going to get through this transition. And I've got stories in this book about people who are trying to grow food in very non-damaging ways, getting nitrogen fertilizer out of the mix. One case, this amazing woman, one of our most famous plant breeders, Molly John, the delicata squash that everybody grows in their garden, thanks to her. She's now looking at, instead of farming macrobes, farming microbes, pulling excess CO2, nitrogen, hydrogen out of thin air and combining them with microbes, like we use for making sourdough bread or whatever, to grow, tasty food that, she's got a grant from the U.S. Department of Defense, the DARPA, to do this, which is, it's rather ironic that the Department of Defense is one of the most forward-looking agencies in the U.S. government, because they're always thinking about security issues in the future. And food is really important. But, her goal is not just feeding a platoon out there in the middle of nowhere, but making everybody's kitchen potentially a farm. That would really, really, she calls it ubiquiculture, not aquaculture, not agriculture. I mean, that could be a game changer. I go into the MIT's plasma fusion lab, where a bunch of brilliant 23-year-olds came up with a breakthrough that may give us fusion energy. That would be regular utility energy, but instead of burning coal, we'd be burning nothing. We would be doing the same thing that makes stars shine, and it's no carbon and it's no radiation. That could really buy us some time on this planet. So stuff like that, it was thrilling to see it. Does it solve everything? No, by no means. If we're all driving electric vehicles, we'll still have traffic. We'll still have all these roads going everywhere and sprawl. So,
right. We'll still need those mines to get our lithium out and other minerals that are needed to power those EVs.
Right. But, fusion energy and another energy form that I show in this book later on, called hot, dry rock, which is basically anywhere on Earth tunneling down to where there's heat. And they're now using lasers, which are much faster and much safer than using mechanical drilling. They don't melt down. That does not involve mining anything. That involves energy sources that are just already right there. Will these things work? We're going to have to stick around to find out, but it's so heartening that people are trying, and they're really, really mission driven.
Yeah. Yes, as you mentioned, those things could buy us some time. I guess I was asking about, the idea of growth and capitalism because, we live in a country where, buying is sort of a national sport, and many people enjoy doing that and are sort of driven to do that and told that it's a good thing. And I'm wondering if, part of sort of bringing it to this idea, back to the idea of hope and to what we can do, from our kitchen tables and living rooms. Do we need sort of a revolution of how we live our lives, on a daily basis, and and how we participate or don't participate in this so-called, consumer economy?
Well, the long-term answer is yes, and we will arrive at that long-term answer because we will have to. But in the short term, we need to do some things right now to staunch the the temperature increase on this planet and the species loss on this planet. We need to be able to produce food in a much safer, less damaging way. And I applaud those attempts. In my last book that you mentioned, Countdown, there's a whole chapter about the economics of no growth or even population reduction, and there's a brilliant Japanese economist in there who explains, because his country is already shrinking for reasons I explained in the book. Japan has peaked, and ultimately he says it's going to be a very good thing economically. I mean, I won't go into all the minutiae about it, but one thing, think of it this way. As the population shrinks, that means that there are fewer people for the labor force. Now, that freaks out economists. I mean, one of the reasons that they love big populations isn't just lots of consumers. They want a lot of miserable people fighting over, jobs, and they will work for miserable wages. But when there are fewer workers, they become more valuable. So their salaries are going to have to go up, and they'll become more productive. The economy will benefit. The people will be happier in their jobs, and we can really do well. And he goes into much more detail about how you can go into a post-growth economy. I mean, even Adam Smith, the great philosopher, founder of capitalism, talked about eventually, things just reaching a stable point. And we, nature is always looking for a stable point, and we're going to have to arrive at that too. But, I want to mention, a lot of your listeners will know my previous book to that, The World Without Us. And that's the one in which I, theoretically extracted human beings from the landscape. And very presciently, I said, by a Homo sapiens specific virus. And that book became very popular again during the but the idea was to show what nature would do if it was relieved of all the pressures we put on it. And it turns out that nature is incredibly resilient, and it recovers really swiftly and beautifully in many ways. And eventually it refills all those empty, niches. And by the end of that book, I was no longer worried about the planet. The planet's going to be fine. It's gone through 5 major extinction events, even worse than the one that we're perpetrating right now. And it always comes back really beautifully. But the big question is, will the world that allowed us to evolve come back in a stable enough way that we can continue to prosper? I certainly hope so, and that's why I wrote a book about hope. But, in the end, just like everybody dies, every species eventually goes extinct. But I'm frankly not ready for my species to go extinct. We're, it's still, really, we still really do beautiful things on this planet. And, along with going into nature, to replenish. I think it's really important that we go and we take our children into museums, into art galleries, into concerts, to instill them with these things that still make us proud to be human beings. I mean, we can't live on a planet with art or music or literature any more than we can live on a planet without trees. And I've got some amazing artists in this book. There's a woman named Meridel Rubenstein who was in Iraq with Azam, because she has created art in every U.S. war zone since Vietnam. Or Jaeun Choi in Korea, who's bridging the Korean DMZ with art. I mean, these are truly inspiring people. They fill my soul and they keep me going.
So maybe it's, maybe as you mentioned, nature is resilient. Maybe it's about us both moving aside to allow nature to regenerate and do its thing, but also, bringing our full humanity and our ideas and our courage every day to, add our little part to this and try to make it a better place.
Yeah, I mean, we can be part of that thing. I mean, I'm surrounded by regenerative farms here in New England where I live. There's a chapter in this book along the Mesoamerican Reef, which is the world's second longest after the Great Barrier Reef. It runs from the Yucatan past Belize and Guatemala and down over northern Honduras. And one of the people who's working with all these coastal managers down there, Katie Arkema, who's with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories Coastal Science Division, she's showing, they're facing these rising warming seas, but instead of building rigid breakwaters that end up just failing, she's shown them how natural systems like preserving sand dunes and mangroves, they will move with the changing coastlines to soften the impact on the human populations in there. And in Bangladesh and New York Harbor, I saw people doing the same thing with oyster beds. I mean, there used to be oysters ringing New York Harbor, and now they're coming back. Even if coral reefs go, in some places, oysters may be able to fill those protective breaches. So, we're going to be forced to try these things when other systems fail. And I hope the transition isn't that drastic. But by working with nature, there's a whole chapter set in the Netherlands where they've learned how to, work with rivers that could flood them by simply giving them room to flood. And then, if people lose their crops because the river had to flood that year, then they indemnify them for them. And it turns out to be cheaper than trying to build big dikes along these rivers that are going to fail anyhow. I mean, there are so many wonderful approaches that I came across. I mean, there was stuff that I just couldn't even get into the book. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. I really appreciate you sharing these stories with us. And for those who want to hear more, Alan Weisman is speaking at Powell's Books tonight at 7 p.m. And I'll drop a link to the event in the online post of this podcast. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcast. It helps people find the show. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/podsupport. Until next time.